taught a lot of social justice courses. And, I was all about, power to the people. And I used to believe in ripping the Band-Aid off. But I've learned that even when something is meant to help us, how it's done really matters. And recently, Priscilla was helping me at work with something, and she cut herself. We were talking about how it can be really challenging to deal with blood and needles, and it reminds me of actually whenever I go to donate blood or get a shot, um, I'm terrified. I think we're both terrified of needles, and I always ask the nurse to to talk to me, and I look away while they're actually putting the needle in my arm. And it helps me regulate, and it helps me to just actually accept that and usually the pain is a lot less when I'm not looking there. And it's the same in our classrooms, right? We know from research that emotions are contagious in classrooms. Students pick up on adult stress, enthusiasm, and tone. So even when there's nothing that's said out loud, there's a lot that's said in our body language. There's a lot that's said. I'm sharing this because how we approach well-being matters just as much as what we do. And this brings me to something central. Whether we intend to or not, we're always regulating, modeling regulation. We're always doing that. So this means that our bodies matter, our pace matters. Students are really good at tracking our nervous systems long before they track our words. And research consistently shows that classroom climate shapes engagement, it shapes bullying and achievement. Warmth invites participation, fear and anger shut it down. I don't know why it's going backwards. There we go. So a meta-analysis showed that positive classroom climates are linked to better engagement, social competence, and lower distress. But climate isn't just built by policy. It's built by daily interactions, by our pace, by our presence. Energy is contagious, and so is calm. When we understand what that presence shapes climate, it changes how we relate to urgency. Because not everything needs speed, some things need safety first. When students are stressed, they regulate through relationships first. And we know that when adults slow the pace and stay responsive, regulation tends to follow. This is what we mean when we say that co-regulation comes before self-regulation, right? We're assisting our students in regulating. And I'm not offering this as like an expectation. I'm offering this as an option, things that you can return to when capacity allows. So we're gonna just take a few deep breaths. I'm gonna take a deep inhale, exhale. Deep inhale, exhale. Deep inhale, exhale. I like to remind myself to breathe throughout. We try to start our team meetings with some check-ins. And it's the same when we're dealing with a student, when we're dealing with staff, anyone, right? Just asking yourself before responding, is it truly urgent? Does it need clarity first? Right. And so, as I mentioned on the previous slide about urgency, slowing your pace by even 10% can change how something lands. So before responding, I like to pause and ground. I like to check my pace before assuming urgency, and then I choose my language, choosing language that keeps connection intact. So there tends to be a language shift. For example, instead of saying someone's difficult, you can try saying they're having a difficult moment. And it doesn't necessarily remove accountability, it just changes our posture. It's something you can do in the hallway before a meeting, before responding to a student. The deep breaths are essential and necessary. And research shows that regulation is actually learned through repeated supportive interactions, not willpower. So a lot of times we think, we just had a student who was having challenges, and I've heard someone say, oh, he has anger problems. We're not, some people are born just super chill people. We all know people like that. But a lot of times it's just about repeated actions and training ourselves and taking deep breaths and grounding yourself before any challenging conversation is a great way to do that. When educators are supported, classrooms become more humane. And when classrooms are humane, students thrive. I'm a really big fan of permaculture. Priscilla knows this. And it's a concept that everything in our ecosystem is regenerative, right? And so when we're looking at any natural environment or ecosystem, we can see that every living organism has a role, it has a purpose, right? And if we can emulate that in our classrooms, then we see that we can create spaces where every student feels like they have a role, they have a purpose. And that's really what regeneration is about. And so I don't think it's idealism. I think it's what we see over and over, even in nature. These things are things that you can do throughout the day. When one person is supported, the whole ecosystem gains capacity. And so my big takeaway is that you're allowed to slow down, you're allowed to tend to yourself. It's not extra, it's essential. I know that we're all in really fast-paced environments, and I actually feel like when I was a teacher and I had students and I had papers to grade, it was actually easier to slow down now that I'm an administrator because different people come to me with their challenges and people want quick fixes. I have seen just this week in real time when we tend to slow down before making a decision. We tend to come up with better solutions. We tend to take into account more factors. And so that is the invitation I have for you all to slow down and to tend to yourself, to tend to your communities, to tend to your teams. Thank you. Go ahead, Priscilla. I know you've got a lot to share, so I made it a little brief.
Thank you, Shaakira. I don't know if Ernestina had something to say before I continue with mine.
Please proceed.
Okay, I'll go ahead to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
You can see it.
Okay, great. So I will be talking primarily on supporting student mental health. And thank you very much, Ms. Shakira. I think it was a very intentional way to start this session because sometimes as teachers we feel that we have to react to every single thing. And it's also important for us to pause and just take a deep breath and just be in the moment before we proceed to make decisions. And that short reaction time can make a whole lot of difference. So I hope we can translate that and model that to our students, and then hopefully we create a culture where we're not in such a haste to react to certain things. So, moving to my session, I'd like to start with a quote that I resonate with a lot, and this is from Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, and she says the well-being of children and educators is not an addition to the mission of education. Rather, it's the mission of education. And for me, it's such an important quote because it shifts education from being just academic success to really ensuring that it's a holistic process, or we're looking at the whole development of both staff and students. So I think for us as educators, this is something that we can look at and maybe allow it to kind of reframe our practices and the kind of decisions we make. So why student mental health can't wait? And I think that as all of us over the years, especially post-COVID, we have seen and a lot about what's been going on with our students. There's been increase in anxiety and emotional overwhelm. And I think it's not just for students, even for staff as well. There's also been low motivation and disengagement, and we've experienced or seen behavior that masks unmet needs. So there's research that says about 80% of students report feeling stressed on a daily basis. And out of this 80%, 40 of them fail to seek help. So basically, if you've got eight students struggling, four out of the eight students do not seek support for their struggles. So this is quite concerning for us as educators because how a student feels impacts how they behave, and it also impacts the kind of results they get in the long run. So I'd like to ask if we can briefly put in the chat what behaviors are showing up most in our classrooms right now. Are we also experiencing cases of anxiety, or are we seeing that our students are overwhelmed? Or do we see very low motivation and disengagement? If we can put a few comments in the chat on the kind of behaviors we are seeing show up in our classrooms. Nice. Lorraine says she can see her middle child is anxious and prepping for exams. And I think that's something that is quite common across all age groups. And there's also disengagement from Eva. And Elizabeth says children are detached and exhibit some disengagement, which are all very true. And sometimes as educators, we feel a bit helpless, especially when you don't have the tools to be able to support your students navigating these challenges. Anthony says he's noticed that his students lack focus. And I think that's something that we're all struggling with, especially with the onset of students being constantly hooked on their devices, whether it's their phones or their laptops, and having very short attention spans. So sometimes having to sit in a class for 40 minutes to listen to a math lecture or an English lecture can be a bit of a challenge for them. Elizabeth also says anxiety and depression is showing up in younger children, and I can definitely attest to that. In previous years, you'd see most of these cases occurring in middle school or high school, but now we have primary students, students in reception, year one, year two, also exhibiting signs and symptoms of anxiety. And this is a cause for worry across all boards. So these challenges are indeed signals that show that we have gaps in skill sets for our young people, or there are gaps in the protective factors that young people experience in schools, and as well as gaps in support systems. So, looking at all these challenges, how can we support students? And there are tons of frameworks, tons of studies, or tons of structures that work for different settings. But for today, I'd like us to really look at one of the most basic and most widely used frameworks, which is the MTSS. So I'm sure some of us, or most of us, have heard of, or know of, or even practice some of the strategies of the MTSS framework. So just to touch a bit on that, it is a school-wide framework that uses data in providing universal, targeted, and intensive academic, behavioral, and social-emotional support for every student. And the key thing is to ensure that there's early intervention and a proactive approach to student success. So if you look at the diagram, there's a three-tiered system. And at the bottom is tier one, which is the universal support. So this is the kind of support systems that should be accessible to all students. And then in tier two is supplemental supports, which is support systems or additional services that are provided to some students who may require more behavioral, academic, and social and emotional support. So for tier two, is targeted towards some section of the students, whilst tier one is targeted towards all students. And then tier three is intensified support. So these are services that are specifically for intervening in extreme cases. And these are normally very few students if you look at the pyramid. And if your MTSS framework works well, you might realize that your tier one would be very strong and you would have very few students in tier three. So looking at why we would even need the MTSS system in the first place, the question we should be asking is, what actually protects our students' mental health in schools? Or what are the protective factors that support student mental health? Or do our students have these systems in place? So I put together 5 key areas that we should be looking at or we should be considering when looking at protective factors for student mental health support. So the first one is feeling of belonging. So can you reflect on the status of mental health in your school and identify if your students feel connected with the school's ethos or the school's vision, or if they feel accepted by their peers and by the teachers? Are you able to identify where the level of belonging is in your school? The next session is trusted adults. And here you want to find out, do your students have a reliable adult in the school to confide in? So this can look like safeguarding officers. This can look like homeroom advisors or school counselors, or if they've got a pastoral carer or even the principal. Are there specific people that students can identify as trusted adults that they can share their challenges or their problems with? And the next factor to look at is emotional literacy. So you want to ask yourself, do your students have the vocabulary and the ability to identify and express their emotions? And this runs through from primary through to secondary, because sometimes the students can identify that, yes, I'm going through a particular emotion, but are they able to correctly verbalize that? The next point to consider is predictability and fairness. And you want to figure out if your students experience consistent and just treatment across boards. And these practices can include disciplinary measures, safeguarding measures, teaching and learning practices. Is there a level of consistency? Is there a level of fairness in the systems? And for dysregulation, we normally realize that these things happen when there's a change in routines. So, do you have a set routine that supports students' emotional regulation? And then finally, you want to look at voice and agency. So, do your students have an opportunity to express their opinions and make choices that um, protect them in the school or that help their educational journeys become more successful? So, these are some protective factors to consider when you're looking at the status of mental health in your school. And what can you do to support your students? Looking at the MTSS framework. So we're going to look at tier one, which is the universal support. And you want to find out what can educators do on a daily basis to be able to support their students. So the first one is emotional check-ins. So creating mood meters or using these as kind of icebreakers in the mornings during homeroom time, or just as your students are coming in, you start their day with trying to figure out where they're at emotionally. So you might have different prompts or questions, or an example such as the scale of 1 to 5, where you have different questions and different prompts, and you have your students rate where they're at on a scale of 1 to 5. Another example is, how full is your cup today? So this looks at where their scale of maybe negativity is. Do they view their cup as half full or half empty, and why? You can also consider predictable routines and calm transitions, because as I mentioned earlier, these are some of the main things that create dysregulation. If a student is used to a routine and the routine changes, how is the change communicated, number one? And number two, what kind of support is provided for students as they transition through that change. If they're just left to their own devices, there's a high chance that dysregulation may occur, and then we might have some of these behavior challenges. Also, explicitly teaching coping skills. And that's one of the areas that a lot of young people struggle in. They can identify that, yes, they're going through emotional challenges, but they have no coping mechanisms on how to manage those challenges. So, teaching skills such as engaging in physical activity for those who are into sports, or social support through friendships, such as being able to talk things out with your friends, as a way to be able to cope with some of the challenges that you experience. Um, Encouraging creative expression such as journaling, music, and arts, practicing self-care through hobbies and good sleep. And we always tell our students that sleep is just as important as any other healthcare practice. And we know that a lot of students do not sleep because they spend most of their times on their devices or texting with other people in the middle of the night. And then they wake up the next morning with their hormones all over the place. And that can affect their mood in the long run. So it's important to have good sleep, helping them learn how to practice breathing exercises and cognitive reframing, which is a CBT technique that helps students manage strong emotions. So you can look at positive thinking and focusing on what you can control, which is your locus of control. So being able to practice these coping skills with them on a daily basis creates a tool or sort of like a resource bank where they can be able to kind of go in and pick out something that might help them in that particular moment or in whatever situation they find themselves in. And then also using language that normalizes help seeking. Um, for example, you can say, everyone needs a little help sometimes, or I'm glad you came to talk to me about this. Some of these phrases or statements reinforce the student's behavior of coming to seek help. So the next time they have a challenge, they might find it easier to want to come to you because first off, you probably didn't judge them or you were able to give them some advice or some support and they felt safe and comfortable with you. So once you keep normalizing or using these languages, it creates an environment where you're telling your students that it's okay to seek help. Okay. So also another way we can support our students' mental health through the Tier 1 system is understanding behavior as communication. And this is where the trauma-informed lens comes in. So with trauma-informed care, you're considering how past experiences or trauma can have a huge impact on an individual's health or, in this case, behavior. So instead of asking questions like, why is this student disruptive? You might want to consider looking at or asking, what might this behavior be protecting the student from? Or what might the student's behavior be communicating to me? So in that case, you're trying to dig a bit further into the circumstances behind that behavior being exhibited as compared to just looking at the behavior and the consequences. So some of the principles of trauma-informed care is safety before compliance. So you're looking at helping an individual be in a space where they feel safe before you ask them to do something else. And then curiosity over control. So you don't just seek to control the behavior, but you are curious about what's causing the behavior so that you can help reframe those dynamics. And then lastly, connection before correction. So you want to be able to connect with the students, help them understand what their behavior is before you look at how do we correct that behavior. And in all of this, you want to know that a regulated adult can calm a dysregulated child, but a dysregulated adult usually escalates the situation. So if you see a student engage in a behavior that may not necessarily be the norm, how you as the educator is in terms of your state of mind can either escalate the situation or calm the situation. So it's also important that we take our time to really pause and care for ourselves, as Shaakira mentioned. So teaching emotional regulation, it's a skill. It's not something that you're born with or as a personality trait. And because most children between the ages of 8 to 18 find themselves in schools, teachers can be a strategic force in teaching and modeling emotional regulation. And how can we teach this? There's different examples, such as name it, tame it, reframe it. This is a CBT technique that also helps manage strong emotions. So by naming it, you're able to identify what type of emotion you're experiencing. By taming it, you're able to uh, create a practical or actionable step to calm that emotion. So for instance, if you say, or if you name your emotion as anger, you're able to tame it by maybe taking a deep breath to be able to regulate your nervous system. And then you reframe it by trying to figure out what is causing that, or how can you change that negative thinking into a positive thought. So these are quick tools you can practice with your students. Maybe they can mention different emotions, and then you go through the name it, tame it, reframe it technique with them, and then they're able to practice it on their own. And also, as teachers, you can model labeling behaviors. So if a teacher, for example, is teaching in the class and realizes that they're feeling frustrated, and they're able to label it in front of the class by saying, I'm feeling so frustrated, maybe I need to take some deep breaths to calm down. What you're doing is you're showing your students that even you as a teacher can experience some emotional dysregulation. And at the same time, you have skills or you have tools to be able to regulate yourself. So you're modeling that behavior for them, and then they can also end up learning from you. Another thing you can do is taking your students through daily short breathing techniques. And sometimes students might feel it's boring or this is not necessary. But when your emotions are heightened or when you're experiencing even heightened physical sensations, breathing is known to be very, very helpful in regulating your nervous system. So once they're able to practice these short breathing techniques over time, it becomes something that's they know from the top of their head, and in situations like this they're able to employ these techniques. And then also looking at providing movement and sensory breaks during lessons. So after every 30 minutes you might want to ask the students to stand on their feet and practice some movement, just to kind of break the flow of the lesson and to give them an opportunity to be able to calm down and then move on with the lesson. Sometimes when students have a sensory overload, that is when dysregulation happens. So giving them an opportunity to have breaks during lessons can go a long way to help them regulate their nervous systems. And then providing calm corners or regulation spaces. I know most of us may not have schools that are resourced enough to have these kind of spaces, but in your own classrooms, you can just create a corner where maybe there's a mat on the floor, and then if a student is feeling a bit dysregulated, they can just go and sit on that mat. Or you might even have some fidget toys where they can play with it to help them calm themselves down, even if it's for just 5 minutes, and then they can come back and join the class. It helps in that moment, really, and it makes a difference. So we've looked at some of the techniques or the strategies we can use to support students in tier one, which is across board. And the next one is, what can we do to support students in tier two and tier three? So these are students who may need more targeted support. And this can look like providing regular check-ins with a trusted adult. So if you've got a school counselor, or if you've got a homeroom advisor or homeroom teacher, maybe that student can identify that, okay, this person is someone I can connect to or trust. And then that student can have regular check-ins with that teacher or that staff member to be able to share and provide support. You can also organize group sessions that can focus on anxiety or just general well-being, where students are able to support each other, and you just facilitate the session and make sure you're helping them ask the right questions and really reflect on their challenges. And you can also look at clear referral and safeguarding pathways. So if there's a challenge that is beyond what the school can provide, what is the referral process in sending the student to, let's say, a professional? Or if you've got a case that surrounds child protection and safeguarding, what are the systems? What are the structures? Do you have support in place to be able to protect that child in the school and outside of the school? And then lastly, collaboration with families and professionals to ensure targeted support. In schools, it's so easy to overlook some of these things, but it's important to really have a strong and open communication channel between families and professionals so that when you identify a student who may have a challenge, it's easier to be able to reach out to the family and to help the family, even in terms of recommending professionals that can provide support for whatever challenges their children may be facing. So a few recommendations that I think can be very supportive in terms of providing student mental health support. It's important to be data driven. With data driven, you want to look at what implementations or what initiatives are you designing for your students, and then you collect data throughout that process, and you're able to go back and reflect and make more decisions based on that data. So maybe if it's working, you might want to continue with those initiatives. And if it's not working, you might want to find out why or look at different alternatives that may be more productive. And I would also say every step counts. As educators, sometimes we feel we want to do everything at the same time. And it's important for us to start small because we can easily get burnt out. So you might want to look at some SEL activities or mindfulness practices, and then gradually you build your way up towards having a comprehensive framework that supports all the three tiers. And another recommendation I'd give is have clear roles and referral pathways. So if you're trying to create systems that support student well-being, you want to ask yourself, who is going to be doing what and how? That way, you're able to streamline processes and you're able to figure out who is responsible for what. And it's easier when everyone is aware of what they're supposed to do. Also, it's very important to provide ongoing training and resources. I know most schools have budget challenges, but there are quite a ton of free resources online or free webinars and professional development opportunities where you might be able to get information on how to support students or even learn from what other schools are practicing or implementing. And then whilst you're trying these new initiatives, it's important to have a constant evaluation cycle so that you're able to pick up what's working and then make the changes as and when necessary. And then lastly, collaboration really makes the team work and the dream work. So foster a team effort among educators, parents, and the community. And maybe I should have added students here as well, because if you can't work with students by identifying what they want or what their needs are, then you might just be doing half of the work. So it's important that we collaborate across all stakeholders to be able to provide a supportive environment for everyone. So thank you very much. And I hope these tools can just kickstart the conversation on how to support both educators and students in your schools. So I'll hand it over to Lorraine for the next section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shaakira and Priscilla. This was very informative. There are a few questions, and one is from Ilyasu Abdullah. He's asking, what will you do when you see a learner angry all the time?
Shaakira, would you want to answer first?
Sure. Thank you, Priscilla, for sharing those wonderful techniques and tools and frameworks. That's a great question. I'm always a big fan of asking the student, right? A lot of times we can, we're so intentional and it's really easy to overanalyze or make assumptions. But the students tend to know what's going on. And so, setting up time before class or outside of class, but, not necessarily right when class is starting or not in front of the entire class, then they might feel awkward. But inviting that student to come and see you and letting them know, hey, I've been noticing that your energy is this way, or you seem upset, or, asking them what's going on. The fact that you've noticed, a lot of times there's a saying that hurt people hurt people. So a student might be bullying or might be mean to other people because of things they might be experiencing in school, outside of school, at home, right? They're whole individuals with complex lives, just like us. And so sometimes it's as simple as asking the student, what's going on? What happened to you? And holding that space and just showing them that you've noticed can go a long way. And they may not always just come out and share everything that's going on in their life. But the fact that you're checking in and asking, what's going on, what happened, how can I assist you, and sometimes they might even need more direction. Is there anything I can do to create a smoother transition for you when you're entering my class? What's working in other classes, right? And so just having that conversation. But a lot of times students, even very young ones, my 10-year-old is very articulate and can tell you what he needs at the moment. And students love having that agency and that opportunity to express their needs. I'll let Priscilla add.
Awesome. Thank you, Madam Shakira. Just to add a little bit to what she said, I think sometimes it's important, like I mentioned in the trauma-informed care, is to really take a step back and figure out what is this behavior trying to teach. So I would say that looking at if a student is coming to you angry all the time, what are the things that you should not do and what you should do? You should not publicly shame or confront that student just as they're in the middle of whatever emotional outburst. And you shouldn't argue with them when their emotions are high. We've had incidences where the more you try to argue with them, the worse the situation gets. And you don't want to assume that this learner is difficult or disrespectful. But what you can do instead is to stay calm and regulated yourself. Because as I said earlier, a regulated educator can regulate a dysregulated student. But if a dysregulated educator can only escalate the situation. So you stay calm, stay regulated, and talk to them in a neutral tone, slow your body language, and if needed, even give them some space before having a conversation with them. So you can give them an option to maybe calm down, take a walk, take a deep breath. This was something I learned a few days ago called the help prompt and wait framework. And sometimes when a student is in that space, you want to be able to help them recalibrate or regulate their system. So you don't try to fight the behavior at that moment, but you try to help them recalibrate, and then you can have a conversation with them on what's happening. Most of the time, they react in that way because they probably just feel unheard. So if you're able to create that space for them to say, okay, I'm listening, tell me what's going on, you might realize that the issue may be easily fixed as compared to just lashing out at the students or telling them that, okay, this is who you are, labeling them as difficult. So yeah.
Absolutely. Let me add to that. As you saw in both of our presentations, like regulated adults are essential. And so do not take it personally. Remember that you are the one in control and ultimately the one with power, right? The dynamics are there as well. And so trying not to take things personally, as Priscilla said, pausing, checking in, definitely not screaming. We've seen so many instances, and as she mentioned, the training that we have now at our school, we're working with a trauma-informed therapist to train our community on how to de-escalate, right? And a lot of times our behavior, as I mentioned, like energy is contagious. So sometimes we don't even know we're triggering students. And sometimes it's even, we don't even realize it, but it's like our own attitude. And they're just mirroring our behavior. And as I mentioned in my presentation, this work is really intentional and it's sensitive because a lot of times we recognize that there might be practices, behaviors, or habits that we have that aren't necessarily promoting that. And a lot of times, by by regulating our bodies, our words, by taking that leadership, we can transform the cultures and the spaces that we coexist in with others.
Thank you all so much. One last question is, how can educators create space for voice and agency? What are some small shifts in practice that supports this? Mhm.
You want me to go first again, Priscilla?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I guess I'm sure we'll just hop back and forth as the first one. So there's so many that you can do in the classroom to promote voice and agency is what I heard. Wonderful. And so when I used to teach in the classroom, I used to teach history. I would literally, even for assignments, sometimes I'd give options, right? You can do this or this. Or when they had to do research papers, I'd allow them to select their topic. I'd scaffold, of course, and so you give options. But a lot of times they get excited just exploring by that way. Whenever we're doing an activity in class, I used to always give them opportunities to write and reflect on their own before jumping into a classroom discussion, because a lot of times we find that some students are slower processors, right? Or they need a little bit of time to gather their thoughts. And so that also creates a level of equanimity when everyone has had time to develop their ideas before people start sharing. Um, Creating more voice and agency, even with, we used to, when I worked in some independent schools in New England in the US, a really big part of the learning culture there was, now my mind is blank, but the tables where we used to all sit around and talk and ask and answer questions. And so I used to offer roles for people, right? But the Socratic seminars, there we go. And so a lot of times I have a professor who used to say the one who does the work does the learning. And so allowing the students to take charge, not necessarily like leading the class, but allowing them to teaching them how to design questions, teaching them how to engage in healthy discourse. That's extremely important now because we don't necessarily always see that modeled in the media. And so that's a great opportunity as well with project-based learning. Even now, where I just had a meeting today. We're talking about homeroom and creating planners for our students, right? And helping them to develop their executive functioning skills. So at first we were looking online like, oh, which planners are great? And then we said, wait, why don't we have them design the planners, right? And then they can articulate what they need, what's most essential. And so a lot of times when we're creating ideas, we as Priscilla mentioned earlier, like a lot of times we might forget that the students have a say too. And it doesn't mean that they're making the final choice, but literally by allowing them to sit at the table and to practice that. I, our students, our SRC, today I met with our Parent Student Association. It's like, hey, SRC wants to have a seat at the table. They want to collaborate with you. And the parents are like, okay, well, let them prepare a presentation so they can tell us what their goals are. And they're excited. They're like, ooh, we get to show up, right? And so a lot of times we find that with students, they tend to stand up, they tend to rise to the expectations we set for them. And so by setting expectations and teaching them how to engage, they will level up and they will impress and surprise everyone in the community. And I know that they at that age, they're very eager and through adolescent development, they're co-creating their identities with us, right? And so by offering these opportunities for them to be creative, to design, we're allowing them to explore themselves and find more things that they're interested in and make mistakes and correct them, right? It's such a beautiful and messy process. Go ahead, Priscilla.
Absolutely. I was just listening. I was like, yeah, I was just remembering all the things that we've done with students, even across the
Mhm.
years. And some of the examples are such as co-creating expectations in class, for example. So every year at the start of the school year, we have things we call essential agreements that the teachers kind of sit with the students in the morning and they're like, okay, what are you expecting from me as a teacher? And then the teacher goes, what am I expecting from you as a student? And they co-collaborate and create these essential agreements. And in a way, it's a way to kind of get students or shared ownership in how the class is run in terms of acceptable behavior. And it goes a long way because this is something they agreed on. So they have a sense of ownership over. And then looking at SRC, for example, over the years, our SRC has been quite instrumental in some of the decision taking in the school. So looking at things like uniforms. So students went up to SRC and said, maybe we don't really like the uniforms we're wearing. We want to get something more breathable or have different options and colors. Some schools or some administrations would have just said, this is the uniform, that's it. You like it or you don't like it, end of story. But then the school's management team said, okay, let's sit down with the SRC. What would you like to see in the uniform? What are the challenges that you have? Let's co-create, let's design. So the current uniforms our students are wearing were fully designed by students, and it was just produced based on what they wanted. So the just a few things here and there that can be done, even with asking questions in classrooms, for example. You don't want to always ask questions that have a right answer. You want to give students an opportunity to really tell you what their perspectives are. So asking very open-ended questions and even follow-up questions in a way creates a comfortable space because they're like, oh, the teacher is interested in what I have to say, or I'm not being shut down because my answer is not the right answer. So these little activities here and there are a way to gradually increase student voice and agency, and then their confidence begins to rise and they're able to make decisions that positively affect their lives. So there's still a lot more that can be done, but these are a few steps on what we have done as a school and that can be practiced other places.
Thank you all. One last question before we go. How can school management use the onboarding process to genuinely care for new teachers' well-being and set them up for a positive and sustainable start?
Mm.
That's a
That's a
good
great
one.
question, and all of these questions are great. And it's funny because Priscilla, at the beginning you mentioned, you're excited to learn from them. Like, me too, but we haven't really had as much time to hear some of the practices that other people are using in their schools. This is a great question. And the first thing I'd say is the onboarding process is something that should be more than just done at the beginning of the year. This year, we actually started to expand that. So we have check-ins throughout the year. But I'll say that we all know we've all been new at a place, right? And so you kind of go through the honeymoon phase, and then you're like trying to figure out what's going on, trying to remember how to use the printer, right? There's so many challenges. And so part of that is making sure that you recognize, as I mentioned in my presentation, like it's not just a one-time thing. You don't just like arrive. Well, it's a constant um, state that you're striving to be in. It's a practice. And so trying to care for new teachers means having an ideally a year-long program, right? Where you have the onboarding at the beginning, but then you have check-ins throughout the year. If it's anything as simple as a monthly, ideally even a bi-weekly or monthly check-in, in my humble opinion, right? Where you're simply going through the calendar. So if you do a monthly, it's like, hey, these are all the things happening this year. And people get to ask about, well, what's going on here? One of the things that we find is when you're looking at any community and you want to know, how do people feel that they belong? You recognize that there's some rituals or there's some routines, right? And so you can think of any community you belong to. If it's a temple, if it's a church, if it's an extracurricular, when you go to swim practice, whatever you go to, and kind of know how to show up. You know what to wear, what to do, all of these things. And when we look at our schools and the school culture, there's so many unwritten rules because everyone just kind of knows, oh, this is what we do, right? And unless your school has a handbook of school culture and practice, there's a lot that people just won't really understand until they experience it. But when you have these intentional, systemized check-ins, you're providing a space to go through that with staff so they can answer, well, what does this actually really mean? Or what are we doing? Oh, you should really know this song because when we celebrate Independence Day, everyone's going to sing this song, right? And so those are little things that you can do so that when the event arises, when the parents come, when anything happens, people feel a sense of familiarity, not because they've been through it, but because they've been prepped and someone has informed them. Those things can go a really long way. And so that's an example, but having that consistency, having a mentorship program so that staff can be new staff can be paired with. I remember once I've worked at a few schools, so I'm kind of comparing or implement the best practices. But I know there was one school I worked at where every new staff had a mentor, and that mentor was actually not in the same division as you, not in the same department as you. And so you got to ask them things and get that kind of insight and still feel like there was a little disconnect as well in terms of you're not seeing them every day, you're meeting up just for this program. I know that time is running out, so I'll pause there and see if Priscilla has anything to add.
Well, I think you just said everything. I was going to touch on a bit about getting a mentor, and I think it's so important because sometimes you get into a new school right from the bat, the work begins, and then you get sucked into all the drama that can happen. And sometimes halfway through, you realize, oh my gosh, I still have no idea how ABCD works in this school. Or they might mention a particular abbreviation, like I've never heard this before. And I know at Iris, for example, we're notorious for our abbreviations. So it's always great to just have that one person that you can go to and ask all the silly questions, all the questions that you probably won't ask your head of school or your supervisor. And having those consistent check-ins where just once, even if it's once a month, you can just really talk about what are the challenges you're experiencing, what's working for you, and having well-being also as kind of part of your professional identity, because sometimes as new staff in schools we want to really show our worth, and that can end up leading to excessive burnout or working more than you're supposed to. And I think if right from the beginning the school management really prioritizes staff well-being as part of the culture, then staff would feel that, okay, it's okay for me to take my time and to do things at this pace and to really not focus on just showing progress, progress, progress. But progress can sometimes be slow. So these are some practices that can really sort of create a culture where people feel like they can express themselves in a way that is productive and it's helpful and it's okay for their individual journeys. So yeah.
Thank you all for joining us tonight for this amazing webinar. We really appreciate it and we do not take it for granted. I would want to invite you all to our next webinar on AI and tech on 19th February from 7 to 8 p.m. by Ms. Benita and Jeremy Aqua. I invite you all and I would send the link and the recordings right after this. And I would want to invite all educators to submit a proposal for our National Educators Conference, which is scheduled for 18th July 2026 on Future Forward, Scaling Innovation Through Action and Inquiry. Dr. Adams, please, would you want to speak on Renewed Journal?
I would love to. So next week we will have an informational webinar for those of you who are interested in publishing in our journal. We welcome Ghanaian educators to share their best practices around teaching and learning and leadership. And if you have any questions about what kind of submissions we accept, you can join us next Tuesday from 7 to 8 p.m. and we will share the Zoom link on our LinkedIn and our socials. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
And
we'll have
please
that.
join, sorry. And please join Ghana ASCD today. You can go on our website and fill the forms and we'll take it from there. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you and we'll see you next month, same time on the 19th of February. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.